They work on the idea that there is a proposed increase. Baseline budgeting means the budget deficit and spending will go up steadily over the next 10 years. In the next 10 years, the plan is to spend $10 trillion of more money. So when they talk about cutting, and this automatic cut that came out of the Congress failing to have a budget, and then the super committee making a super mess of things, then they come up and they say, we're going to cut over $1 trillion over 10 years of the $10 trillion of the proposed increases, and they think you're supposed to believe that.
Liars.
You know, and there are no cuts. So if you cut $1 trillion over 10 years, you're cutting $100 billion. That used to be a lot of money, but nowadays they don't think that's very much. Pretty soon they're going to be talking about quadrillions rather than just trillions. But that won't add much, because literally our national debt is going up $100 billion every month. And $100 billion every month is average. But this February broke all records. Just the February payment went up. The debt went up $200 billion in 1 month.
Yep.
It is very clear. Common sense tells us it's unsustainable. It's damaging, because the principle is that if there's money to be spent, you don't want the politicians and you don't want the bureaucrats spending the money. We want the people to spend the money.
That's right.
In Washington, off and on, wasn't there straight through 30 years, but I tell you what, I've met a lot of politicians and I've met a lot of bureaucrats, and I can guarantee you one thing: they're not smart enough to know how to spend your money. You should spend your own money, not the politicians. Tell you cutting $1 trillion would be harmful to the economy, just tell them it would be much better, because when the government spends $1 trillion, they take the money from the people. That's pain, and that's a loss. But then when the government spends it, and then they spend it on more laws, that's another loss. So you lose twice on it. This very year, on January 1st of this year, 40,000 new laws were put on the books. So I'm looking forward to the day that if you are to see that I am elected, I want to make sure I would like to have a year where we get rid of 40,000 laws. Of laws, we have too many laws, obviously. Which means, though, in order to do this, we have to decide once again what the role of government ought to be. The founders did that. They gave us a constitution. Of course, we have drifted from that. But we need to ask that question, and quite frankly, the Constitution is not complex. It just says it's to protect liberty, it's to protect our freedoms, have a strong national defense, but it's to give us a sound currency. But it's not to run the world. It's not to run an entitlement system. And it's not to run up deficit. And it certainly didn't give the Federal Reserve authority to print money.
No. Central bank and creating new money out of thin air occurred at the Constitutional Convention, and it was an argument between the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians, and the argument it continues to go on. The Hamiltonians won, and they gave us a national bank, and Jefferson got rid of the first one, and Andrew Jackson got rid of the second national bank. But we're waiting for the day when we can get rid of the third national bank. An opportune time for that, because the Federal Reserve will be 100 years old. They came into existence in 1913. They destroyed about 98% of the value of the dollar they inherited in 1913. So I think we'll celebrate next year by repealing the Federal Reserve Act as it began. away inflation with the continental dollar, so they wanted to prevent the agony of currency destruction. So they said, only gold and silver can be legal tender, no authority for a central bank, and you cannot print paper money. And look at what we have today. And they thought it was going to work, and for a while it did, because we were so rich, we were issuing the reserve currency of the world, our credit was good, but it's all coming to an end right now. And it especially has been made worse in the last 40 years, since 1971. Because up until 1971, although we weren't on a gold standard, there was a loose link to gold. There were some restraints on the creation of new money. But since 1971, we have been building this horrendous worldwide financial bubble, which we are seeing now coming unglued. And this is what these last 5 years are all about. This is what the chaos in Europe is all about. And our Federal Reserve and our Treasury has indicated that the American people, because we still have some credibility with our dollar, we will bail out Europe. But I can guarantee you, it'll destroy the dollar. It'll destroy our economy and make it much worse for us. So no bailouts of Wall Street, no bailouts of European Wall Street either. The real sinister part of a central bank is that you can hide the effects. It is a tax. When you print money and value the currency, it is a tax. But it's so unfairly levied on the middle class. The wealthy don't care how much gasoline prices are. You know, if you're making millions on Wall Street, if gasoline's $4 or $5, what do they care? But what if you're in the middle class? What if you're poor? What if you're struggling? What if you want to pay your own bills? And gasoline goes from $3 to $5. It can wipe a company out or a family. It can be very, very harmful. So this is the reason that inflation is so damaging, because the tax falls on the middle class, and the people who get to spend the money first have all the benefits. Who gets to spend the money first? First it's the government, then it's the military-industrial complex, then it's the banking system, anybody who has a contract with the government. So therefore it's very unfair, it's immoral, it's bad for the economy, and worst of all, it encourages the growth of big government. It should stop. Yeah. Jefferson argued the case for no borrowing. He lost that argument, and it would have been a good idea that we couldn't even have borrowed. But even the borrowing, we've gone way beyond that. There's a limit to taxation because, the people would resist it. And then we started borrowing. There's a limit to that. Our interest rates go up, and that's why they had to create this system of just creating money out of thin air. So what we need to do, though, is eliminate this ability to finance deceitfully big government, because that encourages the growth of the entitlement system and also the warfare system. And while doing this, they think they can get away with it by delaying the payment, but eventually the payment comes due. It used to be said that we would say, we can't keep spending like this. We're going to pass this debt on to the next generation. There's so many of the young people here. You know what? It isn't the next generation. It's this generation. It's us today, and that's why we have to do something.
That's right.
The entitlement system was introduced when we were still a very, very wealthy nation. We were a creditor nation. Today we are a debtor nation, the biggest debtor nation in the history of the world. But we introduced this notion that, yes, we have to have the entitlement system, because if government doesn't take care of those who are needy, nobody will. But what they didn't realize and didn't understand, and now we're coming to the realization that once the government embarks on taking care of those who are less well off than others, yes, they will create equality. They create equality of poverty, and that's why we cannot depend on the government to produce wealth or distribute it fairly. They can't do it. It's always done through special interest if it's done that way. And that's why you have to challenge the entitlement system. Entitlement sounds like a right. Oh, I'm entitled to this. I want this. I demand this. I have a right to this. But nobody is entitled to somebody else's wealth. Nobody's entitled to that.
No way.
Entitlement system actually created wealth and had a fairer distribution, and we would all be better off, It'd be a little tougher. I'd still argue the case, the moral case against government force. But it isn't the case. They don't make us better off. They make us worse off. They're the ones who create these problems of malinvestment and deficits and all the problems we face. But you know, I was thinking one time, and I introduced legislation along this way to get the American people to understand how much this is really costing. Let's assume for a minute that you couldn't inflate the debt, you couldn't monetize debt, and let's say we couldn't borrow money, and then we had to pay our bills as we went along. What about, under those conditions, make sure that there's no withholding tax, that your businessman, your boss, doesn't withhold your tax and becomes the tax collector, and just say that every one of us, to pay for the war and pay for the entitlements, every month we send a check to the government. I believe it would end rather quickly. People would be so furious about what it really costs. They would argue the case these wars aren't worth it. What are we doing over there? How many years does it take for us to wake up? I say, I would say by now, after 10 years, we ought to wake up, and it's time to come home and bring our troops home from the Middle East. We don't need any more wars. One way, of course, if we wouldn't go to war unless war was declared, there'd be a lot less war. We wouldn't have had one since World War II. That was just even the wealth of this country. We don't go to war in a proper manner. And this week it was a rather startling event in the Senate when Panetta was before the Senate, and he said, well, we get our authority from international organizations like the UN and NATO. Now, Senator Sessions challenged him, thank goodness he was there to do that. It isn't a brand new idea. We've been doing this for a long time, but the American people and the members of Congress are getting a little bit annoyed with this, and so he was challenged and says, where do you get this authority? And they indicated, well, you know, from the UN and NATO, but we will inform the Congress on what we're doing. Well, thanks a lot. This idea of informing Congress, which is informing the people through their congressmen should make the decision to go to war, not the king, not the president. I can promise you, if I am to be your president, I will not be fighting undeclared wars all around the world. The wars that we have fought these past year have added $10 trillion to our national debt. So they're not cheap and they're ongoing. Just think of the expense that is long term, the taking care of our veterans. And so often they don't get taken care of very well. Sometimes they have a hard time getting the medical care that they need. But this is very, very expensive. I've argued the case, I even said this in the debate a week or two ago, and I said, listen to the other candidate. You might not accept my moral argument. You might not accept my constitutional argument, but I'll tell you one argument you can't refute, is we can't afford these wars any longer. But there's a lot more going on than just the wars, the war atmosphere that has happened in this country, whether it's passing the Patriot Act or an ongoing war that we've had for essentially in modern times since in the early 1970s has been this war on drugs. Not a good war at all. $4 trillion have been spent. I don't think it's done a bit of good. It's been very expensive, and it has been a tremendous undermining of our civil liberties. This is the reason so many people now, with the use of the Patriot Act, that they can bust into houses without proper search warrants. And did you know that every once in a while they go into the wrong houses and kill people by looking for drugs? So it is something that we should challenge.
personally have some strong abhorrence of drugs. But I also know from being in medicine and in politics that prescription drugs are our biggest problem with addiction. I'm also convinced that alcohol is a much more deadly drug, as well as nicotine, than is marijuana. I still urge everybody to be cautious, taught my children not to use drugs, and making sure everybody that it isn't the use of drugs. What we should be arguing for is personal choice. You making up your own mind what you want to do with your own body. I suspect we're starting to win this war, this battle against the war on drugs. This week, you know, when you see Pat Robertson coming out for the legalization of marijuana, I was like, something strange is going on in this country. But it's this whole idea of personal choice about what we do with our personal life.